As a New York native, graffiti has always served as set dressing on the backdrop of my city. It was always around me, but it was never on my mind. So with this video, I'm letting my background enter the spotlight, and I'm examining what graffiti really is by focusing on it at its peak. Graffiti is not a new phenomenon. Humans, since the dawn of our existence, have always displayed an intrinsic desire to leave our mark on the world. Graffiti spans from prehistoric caves to ancient Greece to today. So if graffiti has been around forever, where do we get our modern notion of it? Well, in America during the early 20th century, graffiti was closely associated with gang activity. Gangs used graffiti for a variety of purposes, including claiming territory, memorializing dead members, boasting, challenging, etc. But it wasn't long until graffiti returned to its individualistic origins. Meet Daryl Mcrae, aka Cornbread, a man who is widely considered as the first modern graffiti artist. In the late 1960s, he and a group of friends started writing their monikers on walls across Philadelphia. This form of graffiti, later known as tagging, then spread to New York City, and from there, the modern graffiti movement was born. Tagging is the most basic form of graffiti. It's the tagger's stylized signature serving essentially as their logo. But since its modern inception, graffiti has evolved into an art form. This is where the term writer comes from. A writer is simply defined as a practitioner of graffiti, but when used in context, it usually refers to someone with a defined style or someone who has worked on a piece. Pieces simply being complex graffiti paintings. But what does that look like exactly? Graffiti art can be divided into a few stylistic categories. Throw-ups are the most basic form of pieces. Throw-ups usually stick to a limited color palette and are done quickly to avoid attracting attention to the writer. Typically, they use bubble letters, a style of graffiti lettering that consisted of rounded, often interconnected shapes. With more time, bubble letters were used in more advanced pieces like in the work of graffiti writer Phase 2. Another style popular at the height of graffiti culture was called Blockbuster. This style of lettering referred to the big, square shapes that created each letter. It was intended to be clear, legible, and to cover as much area as possible. Graffiti artist Blade was a big proprietor of this style. On the other side of the spectrum is wild style. Wild style is a complicated, stylized construction of interlocking letters and arrows. In fact, it's so stylized that the pieces were often undecipherable to non-writers. But this begs the question, why create something that most people can't even read? Well, why do people even graffiti in the first place? Individuals tag for many different reasons, like recognition and artistic merit. But we can get a better overall understanding by looking at the population that makes up most writers and looking at how and where they live. Graffiti is most common among non-white adolescent males. In New York, boroughs like the Bronx and Brooklyn and neighborhoods like Harlem were where graffiti exploded. The urban landscape and diverse population of New York made it an epicenter of geopolitical division. According to Sociology and Criminology professor Jeff Ferrell, the caretakers of these physically segregated cities control or destroy public space and public community through privatization and physical insulation. And so the writing of hip-hop graffiti disrupts this orderly latticework of authority and reclaims public space for at least some of those systematically excluded from it. Graffiti extends beyond its walls and creates communities as well. Writers often worked in crews under the same tag. These crews subsequently created subcultures that challenged hegemony by drawing on the particular experiences and customs of their communities, ethnic groups, and age cohorts. These subcultures then provided alternative communities that broke down the city's ethnic and financial segregation.
Graffiti was not the only thing that held these communities together. It was also a fear of the police. Graffiti, in and of itself, is a crime of vandalism, which is most commonly a low-level misdemeanor. But as graffiti spread, so did police violence. Writers were beaten with batons, sprayed in the face with paint, and chased by dogs and helicopters. They would often get the police called on them before any vandalism even took place, simply because they looked suspicious. These harsh enforcements of policing were the product of a new criminal theory known as broken windows theory. To understand, let's take a look at William Bratton, former police chief of the LAPD and former police commissioner of the NYPD. Bratton is a key proponent of broken windows policing and a supporter of stop and frisk policy. He and other members of the police force argued that minor forms of disorder, if left unattended, would result in an increase of serious criminal activity. This has been a controversial policing method for decades, and recently a study endorsed by the Annual Review of Criminology found that there is no consistent evidence that disorder induces greater aggression or more negative attitudes towards their respective neighborhoods. It's easy to see why broken windows theory was accepted into police routine when you examine the origins of policing. In the United States, the development of police is centered around one thing: property. In the northern states, the first organized, publicly funded police forces were created in order to protect shipping goods. And in the South, some of the primary policing institutions were tasked with preventing slave revolts and returning runaway slaves. Both of these property-driven agendas were perpetuated by an upper-middle-class frustration with the so-called deterioration of city life. That was back then, so what about now? In the past few decades, there have been a number of court cases that have set precedents regarding the relationship between police and the public at large. In 1975, two women heard screaming in a neighbor's apartment and proceeded to call the police. On arrival, the first officer knocked on the neighbor's door but left when he received no response. The second officer drove through the back alley without ever getting out of his car. Both officers were gone within 5 minutes. When the screaming continued, the women called the police again. This time, their call wasn't even dispatched. Not knowing this, the women later went to check on their neighbor and were kidnapped and assaulted themselves. The women then sued the police department for negligence, and the court responded that the duty to provide public services is owed to the public at large, not to any specific individual, and that the police need broad discretion to act without fear that a jury will second-guess their judgment with the 20/20 vision of hindsight. In 1987, the Winnebago Department of Social Services sued the Winnebago Police Department when a young boy was put in a coma after the police allowed the boy to remain in the custody of his abusive father. The court held that the state's failure to protect people from private violence is not a deprivation of constitutionally protected property or liberty, and that the language of this clause cannot fairly be read to impose any affirmative obligation on the state to ensure that those interests do not come to harm through other means. And in 2005, a woman sued her local police department for failing to enforce a restraining order that would have saved the lives of her 3 children. To which the court responded, state law did not entitle the holder of a restraining order to any specific mandatory action by the police, and that the specific action to be taken is up to the sole discretion of the police. Each of these rulings define our relationship with the police, and the precedents set will continue to be used in the court of law to shape future decisions. It is also important to recognize that we are discussing these cases in isolation, without the context of other judicial practices, like qualified immunity, and economic incentives, like those created by the prison industrial complex. Now more than ever, we need to evaluate not only our internal biases, but the biases in the systems around us. Who, or what, are the police protecting and serving? Why do we define crimes the way we do? And how do we deal with them? How should we deal with them? As graffiti culture becomes increasingly commodified and thus acceptable, we must continue to question the world around us in order to build a better society for the future.